Whether you've just bought your first FDM printer, or looking to start printing miniatures on a machine you've already had for a while, or just expand your army list for any number of sci-fi wargames, then maybe an FDM printed tank is the perfect project for you. No need for any tiny nozzles, special settings, or printing hacks, because tanks are an easy to print project, and they're a great way to get to know your printer. A great chance to learn the settings you need to tweak to get better and better looking prints from your machine. And with a range of parts, it's a great way to get accustomed to your slicer, from supporting large flat panels to orienting and supporting smaller details like mounted weaponry. So, whether this is your first FDM project, or you're just looking for some tips on FDM printing vehicles, I'm Jacob from Painted for Combat, and let's get into it. Today's tank is this awesome design by Puppets War, the Wolfhound, with a full suite of modular weaponry, hatches, and accessories, which are all nicely split up and should make for an easy slicing experience. And I'll be sure to leave the links to this model down in the description, in case you want to pick it up and follow along for yourself. For today's project, I decided on these pieces, which should give me a classic looking sci-fi tank, with dual Gatling barrels, extra firepower on the front, and some flamethrowers just for good measure. I'm not going for any specific proxy here, just printing this up as a cool shelf piece today, but I'm sure that this kit has most of what you would need to proxy it into almost any wargame. Today I'm going to be using the Bambu Lab A1 with its stock 0.4mm nozzle and Bambu Basic PLA. But today's process should be pretty universal, nearly identical on all other Bambu printers, and pretty much the same process on any other printer in general, just using whatever slicer you like to use for your printer with the default profiles for your machine. So let's go ahead and bring these parts over to our slicer. Usually I would be using Orca Slicer, as I generally prefer its support generation, but given that I'll be using the Bambu Lab A1 here today, I figure we'll use the slicer most beginners will already have downloaded if they're using a Bambu printer. And again, that's just because we're going for no additional hardware or software than what you're probably already using with your printer. Before we take a look at any settings or supports, we first need to make sure that our models are sitting nicely on the build plate, rotating them to where they have good contact with the bed, and trying to get any big flat panels facing the top, to avoid any additional layer lines. But most importantly, during this stage, we're trying to orient our pieces so that any big overhangs that will be hovering in midair, and therefore connected to our support material later, are parts of the model that we won't see once the tank is all put together. This is because the parts of the model that are connected to supports often have a much rougher surface than the rest of the print, so we want to hide those as much as we possibly can. Especially for a project like this where you're maybe still getting to know your printer and aren't 100% sure of your perfect support settings to get clean overhangs, being able to hide them away on the connections of the model means that you can dial in those settings while still getting great looking usable pieces for your project. And sticking with that idea, we'll be looking to start this with pretty much default settings. The default profile for the 0.4mm nozzle with Bambu Basic PLA, neither of which should need any tweaking. And because I want to get the best looking prints I can for this model, let's change our process preset down to the 0.08 high quality profile, where we will be making a few very minor changes to these settings, specifically in the supports tab. Firstly, let's go ahead and enable supports, as our parts are going to require them, and just to make sure we can actually remove the supports from our more detailed models, we'll bump the top Z distance up to 0.14, which will simply increase the gap between the top of the supports and the model itself. In terms of actually printing these parts, I'm going to separate my pieces into 4 build plates, with each group of parts needing a slightly different approach to printing, which is where we'll be able to introduce some minor tweaks to their settings for each print. So let's jump over to our first build plate of parts, the basics. These large flat panels should be super easy to get ready for printing. In fact, they're probably almost good to go as is, so let's go ahead and run a slice on these models and see how they're looking. Overall, with no changes, these parts are already looking pretty good. The supports are catching all the critical areas without forcing themselves into places they're not needed. However, there is 1 or 2 areas on these prints that could cause some problems during printing, and that is these first portions of the 2 angled pieces. Both parts have minimal contact with the build plate, and while the bulk of the part is being caught by support material, there is a good portion of this print that will have very little support as the slope continues to expand, and with their slightly smaller contact to the build plate, these might quite easily get knocked off the print bed. Luckily, there is a very simple fix to this. With the model selected, I'll head up to the Support Painting feature, which is where we can add additional supports to the pre-generated ones we saw before. By selecting the paint bucket and changing the angle, just until this tool is outlining the panels of our model, I will simply click on the angled face to tell the slicer to add additional support material here, then doing the same for the other piece as well. And now when we slice these parts, we can see that those areas are being supported. This should give them a bit of help and ensure that these parts remain stuck to the build plate until they connect to the larger supported faces near the top. And just like that, our first plate is ready to print. Now for our second batch of parts, the Greebles, some of our smaller, more fiddly geometric pieces. Again, starting by running a slice as is, we are seeing that these parts are all well supported, and should have no issue sticking to the build plate. However, with these parts having some more intricate details, we can see here that the supports are crawling into hard to reach areas and trying to support parts that don't really need it. These small panels and holes don't really have critical overhangs that need support material. So rather than removing these excess supports after printing and risking marring up our nice prints, let's just go ahead and remove them now. Back once again in the Support Painting tool, I will select the Sphere brush this time, and rather than left clicking like we did before to add supports, I'll instead shift my focus to the areas we do not want the slicer to generate supports, and right click to add a blocker, stopping supports from being generated on all of the areas we're now painting red. And then simply repeating this on the other parts. And now when we slice again, we are no longer getting supports in those areas where they aren't needed, and this should give us a much easier time trying to remove them after the print. If you're enjoying this video so far, or you found it useful in any way, please consider subscribing down below. I have a ton of awesome FDM projects in the works, so it would be great to have you back for the next one. And if you do want to help support me or the channel further, consider checking out the Patreon. For a couple of bucks, you'll get access to the Painted for Combat Discord server and all of my printer profiles. And at the higher tiers, you'll get access to some awesome FDM-ready STLs. The welcome bundle comes with the painting handles I use in almost every miniatures video, along with some other goodies, but you'll also get access to this month's release of FDM-friendly bases. The Rocky Roads. Inspired by many a vehicle miniature, these bases are perfect for any cracked desert road, war-torn highway, or any high-octane miniatures. All designed to print support-free on FDM printers, and sculpted with flat top surfaces to minimize the amount of visible layer lines on the final print. So, whether you want to jump into the Discord and talk all things 3D printing, or just get your hands on some awesome FDM-ready STLs, consider heading over to the Patreon. Links below. On to the third plate of parts, the delicates. These pieces have a lot of detail and limited contact with the build plate. Slicing these as they are shows us a mess of supports that will be a nightmare to remove, and so for these pieces we're going to change their settings individually from the others. By swapping over to the Objects tab, and then selecting all three of our parts, we can now see that we're able to change most of the print settings on just these pieces, without affecting the rest of the project. So, how exactly are we going to combat the massive supports these parts are trying to generate? For these we will simply change their support type to Tree Auto, and select the Slim Tree style. Tree supports act as their name implies, creating branches around the model that connect up to the parts that actually need support, without creating a bunch of unnecessary mess. While the default grid supports are great for holding tight onto flat panels, tree supports are great for organic and intricate models that need more pinpointed supports without a bunch of unnecessary connections. And just like that, these parts are also off to the printer. The final plate, the chunks. These are rather large slabs of plastic, and slicing them up with the same settings as the rest of our pieces gives us an egregious 16-hour print time, with some really annoying looking supports crawling up the model. So here we'll be using all of the tools we've learnt so far to tweak these models for faster, cleaner printing. Firstly, let's change some of their settings. The same as the delicates, we'll move over into the Objects tab and select both of these tracks so that we can edit their settings separately. Firstly, to help decrease print times, we can bump the layer height on these parts up to 0.12, as these really don't need as much detail as some of our other pieces. Alongside this, I will also enable Infill Combination, which on a large part like this will help further decrease print time without sacrificing strength or quality. What this setting does is, rather than printing the internal infill structure on every layer, it will instead print it every 2 or 3 layers, just using a slightly thicker line, allowing the printer to spend less time on the internal parts of the model that we'll never see. To address these supports on this model, it will probably just be easiest to add them in manually, so we'll change the support type from normal auto to normal manual, meaning that supports will only be generated where we paint them on. So let's jump over to our support painting tool again, and start using the paint bucket to fill in any overhanging panels. If you like, you can also turn up this slider to about 45 or 50, which will highlight any areas that are overhanging at those angles. This just helps to guide your support painting and make sure that you don't miss any critical regions. And once we finish using the bucket on the flat areas, I'll swap back over to the sphere brush and paint a line of supports down all of the tracks and smaller details, to make sure that all of the critical areas that need supports get them. By just tweaking these few settings and a little bit of manual support painting, we've taken that 16-hour messy print down to 9 hours and 40 minutes with much cleaner looking supports. So off to the printer they go. Alrighty, now that our prints are all done, let's go ahead and take a look at the quality we're getting. Straight off the bat, I can see that we have some amount of layer line visibility here. Often I would attribute this to printing too fast, but generally speaking the default speeds for the profile we used are pretty good, so this is likely an indication that my A1 just needs a good clean and some fresh grease on the rails. Other than that, we are seeing a few gaps on some of our top surfaces. If you are changing your settings throughout a project, the best way to try and fix this up on your second print would be to slightly increase the top surface line width. Just tiny bumps. Maybe start by moving up to 0.43, and if that's still not quite right, try 0.44 on the next one. Just until you find that sweet spot for your printer. But how about we get these supports off and take a proper look at these parts. For support removal, I'm using a mix of just tearing them off with my hands where I'm able to, but mostly I'm using some cheap nippers to pull them off where needed, and even separating some of the material with a knife for smaller areas or flat connections. These supports have done a pretty good job overall, but on my printer with these settings, these are both a little tricky to remove and not very pretty. To make the supports easier to remove, the easiest way to do that is to increase the Z top distance. Again, just very small increments, maybe bumping it up to 0.15 for the next print. But as we increase Z top distance, we will start seeing worse and worse quality on these overhangs. To help find a balance, you can have a play around with the support interface. That's this dark green bit between the main supports and the model, the layer that your part actually sits on. So if you are getting poor quality overhangs, I would recommend increasing this to be a bit thicker and a bit more dense. This just gives the print a more even layer to sit on, rather than sinking into the gaps in the supports, creating this rough look. So it's really just a matter of finding a good balance between a Z-top distance that gives a good hold while still being easy to remove, and tweaking those interface layers to make those connections as clean as possible. To help smooth out a few of those areas where those layer lines are visible, I'll just go over some of these parts with a very light sanding. And I'm not spending too much time here at all, less than 10 minutes just giving the model a once over and cleaning up all of the flat surfaces that were easy enough to reach with a sanding stick. And with all that done, it means it's time for the fun part. When it comes to assembly for FDM prints, nothing is more simple than superglue. It's easy to find, cheap, and gives a great hold. The nice thing about FDM printing is that you won't see much warping like you sometimes get with resin prints. This makes it super easy to assemble and lets you be pretty confident that everything will just slot into place. And if you do find that your FDM prints are warping, adding a simple brim in your slicer should help to minimize that. This specific kit is designed so that every weapon and attachment can be magnetized, which usually I wouldn't bother to do, but it just so happened that I recently bought some magnets for another project that actually fit this tank, so I think we'll add a few in. Unnecessary, but it's a fun touch. I'll quickly run you through how I primed this model with the airbrush. However, I do have a video up here that covers brush-on priming if that's more accessible to you. Both are totally valid options. And of course, if you have the space to Rattlecam prime, go for it. Given that this model has a few gaps in some of the top layers, and this PLA is quite porous, I decided to go for a thicker primer. To do this, I added roughly 3 parts Army Painter black primer and 1 part gloss varnish to my airbrush, and just enough water to allow it to come out smooth. I then did 1 thin layer over all of the pieces, just to get some primer stuck to the model, not worrying about total coverage, and then, once that dried, I came in with a heavier layer all over, making sure to get into all the recesses and get a full coat of black over the entire model. And after letting that all dry, I came back in with even a few more layers of primer on some of those more obvious gaps, just to try and fill them in a little bit. And with all that done, you now have a pretty great looking FDM tank that you can paint up however you see fit. If you want to see the paint scheme I'm using for this model, it's pretty much identical to the paint job I did on my FDM Dreadnought a while back, which I'll leave up in the card and down below. But for now, I think it's time to take a look at this model all painted up. Even without the tiny nozzles, specialized slicer settings, and 3D printing hacks that we love to boast in this hobby, just using default slicer profiles on what could easily be your first FDM project, I think this tank came out looking great. I think it's a good introduction to getting your head around FDM printing more detailed parts, and a great way to get to know your printer. I cannot recommend a project like this enough. And it doesn't hurt that I'm super happy with this paint job that only took 4 or 5 hours. Drop a comment down below if you have ever printed up an FDM vehicle, or if you've used this video as a guide for one of your first FDM projects, let me know how it went. I'm always super interested to hear other people's FDM hobby stories. Like if you liked, and be sure to subscribe down below to stay up to date with all of my FDM printing projects surrounding the tabletop hobby. But above all else, thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a good one.